no king rules forever. No matter how strong the community, no matter how fun the gameplay, and no matter how riveting the story, every game eventually dies. So today, let's take a look back at the games that defined our entire medium. The ones that at one point dominated our lives, but today stand as nothing but relics to a time long past. The games that deserved more, yet never achieved their potential. And in the process, see what it is that makes these games so great, and how they inspired our industry to achieve even greater in the future.
It's being here now, which is the important thing. You know, there is no past, and there's no future.
To this day, many MMO players would still consider the early days of the genre its definitive peak. And for most, the early days began in 1999 with the release of Everquest. It was a simpler time, where people thought the entire world was going to fall into Armageddon, following a Y2K crash, where all computers' internal clocks would stop in the year 2000. But you see, the original mainstream MMO actually released 2 years prior, in 1997, called Ultima Online. Ultima and Everquest were the pioneers in many ways of MMOs as we know them today. Ultima was lauded for its intense difficulty, lack of level system, and player interactivity, and Everquest was known for taking this formula to the next level, breaking from the traditional Trinity class system and forcing players to be social. Another big MMO at the time was Wars Galaxies, which had an intense focus on player agency, with over 30 different professions each player could be, including a conniving politician ruling entire planets. You see, the thing that made these early MMOs so special, as compared to nowadays, was just how novel and unique they were. It was the first time the gaming sphere had ever seen such large and deep online worlds, where thousands of players could come together and join in guilds and take on adventures. In our modern era, even FPS games like Fortnite or adventure games like Minecraft allowed tons and tons of people to all be on the same map together at once. But back in the days of Ultima, Everquest, Wars Galaxies, and eventually The King, vanilla World of Warcraft, this was a new phenomenon. And because it was new, it was hard. You see, those early games did something that the newest entries even today struggle with. They truly challenged players. If you wanted to get the best gear, you had to grind, every day, for hours, no exceptions. If you died in the open, you lost everything. In Everquest, the world map was massive and dangerous, with high-level mobs patrolling even low-level areas. If you wanted to get around the map quickly, you had to find players that were one of only 2 classes in the entire game that could teleport, and barter with them to use your resources to teleport you somewhere else. In Ultima Online, blacksmiths weren't NPCs in a town, they were other players, and in order to upgrade your gear, you simply had to hand over items and money and trust you would get them back. These pioneers in the space focused on what made MMOs unique, the social interaction, and forced players to have real friendships and groups in order to take down dungeons and monsters. There were also more unique combat mechanics, like being a puller in Everquest, who had to control the amount of mobs in a group at once, since even one mob in the game was so dangerous. The worlds were more risky, but precisely because of this, they were so much more rewarding. Modern MMOs have streamlined much of the janky tutorials and controls of their predecessors, but in the process, in many ways have lost what made MMOs so special in the first place. That sense of satisfaction of truly overcoming challenges. That sense of newness and being excited about a game world you've never seen before. And most tragically, removing the need to even be social. Instead opting to let players solo the entire experience, if need be. It was a move necessary to grow the player base of MMOs over time as they became mainstream, but it's also a move that lost what made MMOs so special. Now it feels like almost every big IP has an MMO, and almost all of them are simply a more polished version of the foundations laid by the greats of old. And this problem is only exacerbated by the fact that MMOs are so expensive and time-consuming to make. Why would a studio nowadays spend hundreds of millions of dollars and half a decade making an MMO when they could just make a mobile game with microtransactions instead? It simply doesn't make financial sense anymore. As the games industry has ballooned and scope has exploded, so too has the feasibility of MMOs decreased, potentially the hardest type of game to make. You see, MMOs themselves never died, but the essence of what made them blow up in popularity did. Other games adopt similar principles now and become homes to massive communities as well. RPGs have better quests, shooters have better gameplay, and esports titles now have more die-hard fan bases. So now, in the modern era, it simply doesn't even make logical sense for almost any studio to put resources into such a massive project in a stagnant genre. What is there really left for MMOs then? I think it's time they finally got back to their roots and once again innovate an industry by providing new mechanics, real challenges, and worlds we can finally get lost in again. It's not about creating the biggest and craziest MMO world ever. It's about creating a place players can call home. Guitar Hero was actually originally spawned off a popular Japanese arcade game called Guitar Freaks, which let players use a toy guitar with buttons to fake playing real songs, and its success led to them eventually releasing the first Guitar Hero under Harmonix in 2005. Other games like Dance Dance Revolution had already garnered some notoriety, so it seemed like a risk worth taking. And it was, because within a year the franchise was gaining massive popularity, and soon many other competitors were coming into the scene. Where now games like Fortnite, Minecraft, and Roblox command attention of the youth, in the early 2000s, it was games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band, where all your friends could get together at once and live the life of a rock star. Because after all, it was moments like this that made gaming so great, and those memories that we'll have forever playing with friends. Party games like this nowadays have mostly died out, replaced by games where we join together online instead. But the essence of what makes them great isn't gone. The satisfaction of laughing and singing with friends. But there is a void now left in our modern time. Games have always been better with friends, just like almost everything in life. And what Rock Band, Guitar Hero, and all the copycats showed us is that sometimes the most powerful thing any game can do isn't about the game itself, but the emotions it evokes within us. We have seen new games like Beat Saber and Crypt of the Necromancer that build on the ideas set forth by these original rhythm games. The ideas of intertwining music directly into the on-screen action is a proven formula now, that only first found its legs years ago. For most of the games on this list, the industry has moved on and in many ways become better. But there is something truly missing within our modern lives that we had back in the day with games like Rock Band. There were a lot of problems though. The cost of entry was high to afford even getting the equipment necessary. The market was becoming saturated with competitors, track licensing was extremely expensive, and worst of all, innovation was nigh on impossible. After all, what could studios do besides adding more songs? And that's why this genre of games has been forgotten to time. They hit the zeitgeist of a population at a perfect time when we were all together at home. But the infrastructure, barrier to entry, and competition with a lack of future focus killed all hope for this genre. And as these rhythm games introduced more and more casual gamers into the medium, those gamers started to move on to other games like Call of Duty. And many who stuck with Rock Band and Guitar Hero eventually decided that all of their time was better spent learning to play a real instrument. And so just like that, as popular as the rhythm game became, it died out in a flash. Honestly though, I think it's only a matter of time until our hearts can be captured again, because Rock Band and Guitar Hero were more than just a fad. They tapped into exactly what makes games so great, especially with friends, and that's something that can always be replicated in the future. To me, the immersive sim genre is the most interesting and fun in all of gaming. From the ground up, these games are made with systems, enemies, and tools that all interact with one another to create a playground the player simply learns to master through gameplay. In 1994 though, one of the greats of this genre and pioneers was released. The original System Shock. It told the story of a nameless hacker who is caught and tried for his crimes, but offered salvation if he can hack Shodan, a hyper-intelligent artificial intelligence aboard the station. For its time, System Shock was a revolution, a game that allowed players to solve puzzles in multiple ways, using stealth, futuristic guns, and a handful of gadgets for hacking and turning enemies against one another, all with the looming horror of the station's inhabitants trying to kill you and a menacing computer simulation speaking in your ear. And this sense of dread was built upon in 1998's Thief, which revolutionized the genre's stealth mechanics with more sophisticated enemy sight lines, a focus on sound mechanics, and a variety of ways to maneuver your way around packs of enemies and shadows of the night. These philosophies even carried themselves into much acclaimed games like Half-Life from Valve, and then later into the now underloved and appreciated original Deus Ex in the year 2000. Deus Ex was the first true modern-day immersive sim that allowed players to use hundreds of different items and weapons to kill, confuse, and hide from enemies. It told a story full of intrigue and conspiracy, of a world cast into cybernetic enhancement warfare, and terrorist groups running rampant, all with a secret Illuminati group pulling the strings behind the scenes. At the time, Deus Ex was the first game that actually gave players a complete freedom of choice. No mission map marker, no holding your hand, simply throwing players into a multitude of environments and telling them to figure it out. But you see, that's the issue. Because the same things that make immersive sims so great is also what makes them so hard to sell to mainstream audiences. Conveying how deep a game is hard in only a 2-minute gameplay trailer announcement. And in most cases, only by playing for an extended amount of time does someone gain an appreciation not for the things they did in the game, but for the things they didn't but could have done. Players who fall in love with immersive sims do so because at one point they realize that each mission has endless ways to solve it, meaning everything we do feels much more earned. It's the opposite of a cookie-cutter, hold-your-hands experience like a movie, and shows exactly what makes games specifically so great. Games like this are hard to monetize as well though, meaning not only is it hard to get players to play, but also to spend. And on top of this, they are some of the hardest games to make on a design level as well, requiring developers to make maps with tons of hidden entrances, ways to solve puzzles, and a host of gadgets that allow you to interact in non-common ways with the world. Take Prey's glue gun for example. You can use it to freeze enemies in place and kill them, or you can discover on your own that you're able to use the hardened glue as a bridge to get to hard to reach spots. It's a perfect example of why games like this are so hard to make. Prey, the greatest immersive sim game of all time, learned from the mistakes and triumphs of Thief, Deus Ex, and System Shock, and made a game where every system, every weapon, every single item you pick up is useful in some way and can be used in a multitude of ways as well. Every part of that game was designed with the explicit intention that every other part of the game would interact with that. And the Prey Mooncrash DLC only brought the genre to new heights by adding on a temporal element as well. But creating such an immersive world isn't easy. So having to have an extremely talented dev team on top of a small addressable market and difficulty monetizing, it's no wonder that this genre of games has never taken off despite how great they are. And while there has been critically acclaimed immersive sim lights like BioShock, the new things like Weird West, another amazing recent immersive sim, don't get the same press. These are some of the greatest games ever made, but simply have been forgotten with time. But I do truly believe that the merits and game design on which these games stand is so strong that one day there will be a studio that can finally make one that breaks into the mainstream, especially as gaming audiences are becoming more hardcore focused. The immersive simulation genre has always been ahead of its time. For kids growing up in the early 2000s, much of their time would have been spent in not just console and PC games, but an extremely popular medium at the time, online browser games. The craze kicked off with entries like Neopets in 1999, which let anyone with an internet connection and web browser create an army of virtual pets that inhabited the world of Neopia. This was followed up by websites dedicated to small browser games, like Miniclip and Addicting Games. Kids would navigate to these pages and be met with a plethora of classics, like Last Stand, Stickman RPG, The Impossible Quiz, Club Penguin, Line Rider, and the creepy Peeping Tom games about spying on unsuspecting girls, a genre that certainly would cause controversy nowadays. Gamers would spend hundreds and hundreds of hours perfecting different playthroughs in each of the games, and finding new items that interested them. It was a simpler time where the internet was new and gaming was not as yet matured, which meant hundreds of crappy and obscure Flash games were being made by really everyone with a basic understanding of animation. I personally remember some of my friends in middle school who would create small Flash games and we would all work on them and play together. But this genre of games was extremely short-lived. As console and PC gaming became more and more popular, the days of browsing games started to dwindle, and this was only perpetuated by the death of Flash, which was the main engine used for building these browser plugin games. With the rise of Facebook, more and more of the player base transmitted to the new social media service, creating overnight sensations like Farmville. And on top of this, many of the browser game sites were coming under hot water for many of their inappropriate games that kids were playing. And other sites like Miniclip caught flack for partnerships with microtransaction-heavy entities. So as time went on, this series of games simply began to disappear, instead lending to new games like Slither.io and many popular clicker games now that can be played on browser. For anyone that wasn't alive during this time though, you truly missed out on one of the most interesting sagas in all of gaming, as it felt like every day a new small indie browser game was gaining traction. Every day at school, kids would talk about new games they had found or high scores they had gotten, and it simply was a different and fun time. Nowadays, the idea of a browser game is even harder to fathom, as new services like xCloud allow gamers to play fully AAA titles in the browser streaming over the internet. So the addressable market has gotten even smaller for these low-budget indie games of old. But even if the height of browser games may be far behind us, it did inspire an entire generation of kids to get into gaming, and also led to companies pushing for more cloud-heavy solutions and browser-based solutions to playing games. To this day, many of the popular games in the world are FPS, or first-person shooter, and as most gamers know, these shooters first got their start with Doom and Wolfenstein in the early 90s. Surprisingly though, games like Doom and Wolfenstein have seen a resurgence as of late, with Bethesda publishing multiple acclaimed and high-selling games to each franchise in recent years. Along with these industry darlings though, there are some other FPS games of old that have been forgotten to time by many. The biggest example of this may be Quake, which originally released in 1996. Quake was a fast-paced arena shooter that focused on quick reflexes and heart-pounding adrenaline-infused combat. Players could learn to travel around the maps at breakneck speeds using strafe jumping, bunny hopping, wall running, and zigzagging, and the skill gap between new players and veterans was extreme, even for the standards of the time, and much more than most FPS today. Games like Quake eventually gave birth to other massive and beloved arena shooters like Unreal Tournament, which was a huge multiplayer offering at the beginning of the 2000s, which spawned many kids' love for esports. And on top of this, other studios in the 90s were taking stabs at the genre with massive titles like the original 007 James Bond game, which let players face off in arena combat with snipers, pistols, and a host of gadgets, something that turned out to be far and away some of the most popular FPS multiplayer gameplay of the time. Sadly though, over time many of these games have lost the original fan bases that made them so notable, in large part due to the immense amount of competition the space has seen. FPS games nowadays may be the most popular genre of all, and this means that there are constantly new studios and veteran AAA developers taking a stab at their own version. This has led countless innovations in the genre, and in many ways has resulted in arena shooters being left behind. Even to this day, Quake, Unreal Tournament, and 007 inspired developers to create amazing arena shooters, but the modern gamers of today simply don't find them as remarkable as before. For example, a recent battle royale called Hyperscape originally blew up based on its fast-paced Unreal Tournament-like combat and weapons, but quickly died out just as fast as people moved on to the newest Call of Duties, Battlefields, and Valorant and Fortnite. As good as the old style of FPS games were, in a lot of ways, the slower pace and more methodical approach to shooting design resonates more with the players young and old now. After all, becoming good at even Quake movement could take hundreds of hours. Either way though, the veterans of the FPS genre are what evolved the modern games into the juggernauts they are now. But that doesn't mean every modern FPS has gotten the same treatment either. In 2012, Jaeger Development and 2K Games released Spec Ops The Line, which is a franchise that should have gotten the recognition of a Quake or Unreal Tournament or even a Call of Duty, but never did. Similar to Call of Duty, Spec Ops The Line thrust players into a campaign across the world, but with many twists and turns and emotional beats that potentially no other game in this genre has even come close to, before or since. It's a look at a game that never got the love it deserved, and instead was forgotten to time because it simply had too much competition to command real attention, along with some technical issues. RTS or real-time strategy games used to be a staple of the industry, but with time have floated more and more into obscurity. In the 90s though, real-time strategy were some of the most popular, with new releases like Command & Conquer in 1995 boasting impressive player numbers. The genre was all about commanding massive numbers of units and waging war against an AI or human opponent, all while managing resource collection and spending. The games demanded some of the most coordinated and quick movements, and this eventually led to new games like StarCraft and Warcraft from Blizzard taking center stage and dominating the birth of the esports scene in places like Korea. Command & Conquer isn't the only now dead FPS franchise though. Others like Age of Mythology were loved at the time, but now for over a decade have not seen a new entry. Recently, a new Age of Empires was released, and it did quite well initially, but its player base and viewership has dwindled ever since. You see, some genres of games simply ebb and flow in terms of popularity, and the insanely high difficulty floor and ceiling, barrier to entry, and lack of dedicated fans has made the RTS genre, as of late, a bad one to be in. Even the kings like StarCraft 2 have lost most of their player base, and no big new RTS seems to be on the horizon that would definitively revive this genre. A lot of this actually can be attributed to the games themselves as well, because when we look specifically at the Blizzard RTS games, the biggest in the entire genre, they're all heavily known for modding. And from this modding scene, we've seen new games and modes like tower defense and MOBAs. Because these mods were such a big part of what the player base was doing in StarCraft and Warcraft, they eventually started to alienate the fans who began playing more of things like MOBAs like League of Legends and Dota more than the original games that spawned them. These games required less management of multiple units and were easier to jump into, which meant as the player base grew and the casual audience ballooned, it made sense they gravitated to games that were easier to pick up and just play. This is especially true as RTS games became more mainstream. They focused more on multiplayer, which made the competition absolutely insane, and many players would get anxiety even thinking about playing against other players because of how stressful and intense each match was. I know that was certainly the case for me with StarCraft 2. But nowadays, even the more casual RTS games coming out, like Halo Wars, are gaining no traction either, as the strategy that makes the series so great is massively reduced. But by keeping that strategy high, the games become too stressful. It's a catch-22 that the genre can't seem to figure out and escape. It's really sad to see because personally, StarCraft is one of my favorite franchises of all time, and StarCraft 1 was the game that actually originally got me into gaming. And the tactical nature and demanding skill required for these games really does make them stand out from a lot of other genres. The racing game genre has always been a divisive subject. It seems that everyone either finds them mindless and boring, or completely is addicted. One thing that everyone can agree on though, is that the 1990s F-Zero was awesome. A futuristic bike racer that tasked players with traveling at hyperspeeds down 360 tracks full of speed boosts and obstacles. It was one of the first arcade racer games of all time, and later went on to inspire new entries like Twisted Metal, which let players cause chaos and mayhem driving into other cars to cause massive explosions. This need for adrenaline even carried over into games like Burnout and Burnout Paradise, which focused on vehicular destruction and pulling off cool stunts. The tragic part about all of these racing games, though, is that they have mostly been forgotten about. At the time, even arcade games like Hydro Thunder dominated mindshare, but they have seemingly all fallen to the wayside now, instead being taken over by the Forzas and Gran Turismos of the world. But that doesn't mean that the legacy has been forgotten. After all, the Forza series and its many DLCs take obvious inspiration from the more fun-inspired racers of the past, and some new Hot Wheels racers recently even have gotten back to the roots. However, for some, these older and legendary franchises seem to have never come back, whether it be because racing games are a more niche genre or fans got tired of the games themselves. Racers like F-Zero even today stand poised to potentially make a comeback. The issue is games like Mario Kart have taken this arcade racer and thrown it into seemingly an impossible situation for any other studio to take on with an IP that big. Either way though, arcade racing games were some of the fondest memories of a lot of kids growing up just a few decades ago. And it will be interesting to see if any of the ideas from these original games come back eventually into the racing games of the future. It seems like nowadays almost every game is an open world game and RPG, no matter the franchise and no matter the genre. Honestly though, it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. After all, some of the biggest and most well-known games of all time have a heavy focus on these elements, like Skyrim, Breath of the Wild, Fallout, and many more. But just because open world games and RPGs have been so loved recently, doesn't mean that some gems weren't forgotten about too. Two immediate ones that spring to my mind are the Prototype and Mercenaries franchises. Both of these were actually amazing games at the time, that both had you feel like a superhero, either in a literal or figurative sense. They both offered a variety of gameplay that was lacking from the bigger games at the time like Grand Theft Auto, and maybe were even more fun because of it. The polish wasn't as good, but the passion and risk-taking was evident, letting players destroy entire cities with tanks, mutating into giant monsters, and they likely were also great inspiration for future games like Red Faction Guerrilla as well, which was one of the first big games advertising the ability to destroy anything on the map. Another long-lost game and franchise. And speaking of which, maybe the most tragically forgotten game of all time in this genre would actually be Sleeping Dogs, which over the years has amassed a sort of cult following, yet still has been largely forgotten by the masses. You see, at the time it was set to be a GTA killer, with amazing graphics, great AI, and a superb story. But on release, the graphics have been scaled down from the original trailers, and bugs and glitches caused most gamers to simply not give it a shot. Remind you of anything? On the more RPG heavy side of things, two massively underrated games that have been largely forgotten about are Alpha Protocol and Kingdoms of Amalur. One is a more modern setting and the other is a fantastical fantasy one. But both of these games offered what many RPG players would consider the dream nowadays. Amazing writing and meaningful and deep choice. Crazy character progression systems, and amazing worlds to get lost in. But once again, either due to horrible combat mechanics, a plethora of bugs, or just targeting a more niche market, neither of these absolutely riveting RPGs are remembered in large part today, instead both being subjugated to small fan groups. At the end of the day though, sometimes not every game can be successful. Sometimes audiences just don't click with the product or fail to see at first what makes a game so great, because of technical issues upon release or simply not enough people giving it a shot. So for most of these great and forgotten open world games, racing games, RPGs, shooters, and MMOs, many things can be blamed, whether it's the combat or a better competition or a lack of features. But they're still presented something that so many cult fans love to this day. It's the same reason I personally love Prey and Cyberpunk 2077, despite the hate or lack of attention either has received, because sometimes the greatest games of all time are forgotten. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because something that can cause people to become so vehemently passionate is also likely not going to land for everyone. So for most of these legendary games that were forgotten, maybe it was always supposed to be that way. Maybe the best things in life aren't ever actually the most popular, but maybe just the ones that speak to us on a more personal level. And as always, thanks so much for watching, guys. Comment down below what games I missed that you think are the most forgotten games of all time. And if you didn't know, I stream every weekend right here on this channel, so if you want to see my face and stop by and say hi and see what I'm like kind of in person, make sure to check those out. And on top of this, you can see highlights from my streams and my videos on my second YouTube channel, my TikTok, or my Instagram. And if you want to support what I do here even more, make sure to join our YouTube membership program and get access to multiple perks, including a private chat room. Once again, thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you next time.